She said it like she was reading a fact from a document. Not crying, not asking for reassurance, just stating something she had decided was settled, the way you state that the bus is late, or the weather is wrong, or a thing you wanted is no longer available. The dress was halfway down her back. Her hands had gone still. The zip had stopped somewhere around the middle, and she couldn't reach the angle to work it free, and she had been trying for long enough that she'd moved past frustration into something quieter and more permanent. I stepped forward without thinking. She didn't move. I said, "I do." The room went very still. Neither of us moved for a long moment after that. The zip stayed exactly where it was. Some things are more important than the zip. My name is Daniel Reeve. I'm 36. I write technical documentation for a software company that builds project management tools, which means I translate things engineers find obvious into language that the rest of the world can follow, a skill that has proven useful in more areas of my life than I expected. I work from home. I make excellent coffee by 9 a.m. and increasingly mediocre decisions after 11 p.m. I live in the kind of apartment that is described in listings as spacious for one or comfortable for two, which is the real estate industry's way of saying you will either feel the square footage or you will not, depending entirely on who is standing in it with you. Her name was Nadia Voss. 33. She'd taken the second room after answering my listing in October, when her previous arrangement ended in circumstances she described, on the day we met, as a situation that required me to leave quickly and take my bookshelf. I did not ask follow-up questions. She had a bookshelf worth rescuing, which told me most of what I needed to know about her priorities. She was a graphic designer who worked freelance, which meant she kept unusual hours and occasionally appeared in the kitchen at 2 p.m. with the expression of someone who has just solved something that has been bothering them for days. She kept a jar of good pens on the kitchen counter. She had opinions about fonts the way some people have opinions about sports teams, detailed, slightly irrational, and completely sincere. She was the kind of person who noticed if you'd rearranged something and said nothing but quietly rearranged it back, which I found out about the spice rack in week 2 and chose to find endearing rather than territorial. She had moved in with a wariness that I recognized as earned rather than unfriendly. She kept the bathroom tidy, her door closed when she wanted space, and her life mostly separate from mine in the way new roommates do when they are being careful with a stranger. She was polite in the considered way that people are polite when they have been burned and are not yet sure the new arrangement is safe. I gave her the good bathroom shelf without being asked. I left coffee in the pot on the mornings when I heard her working late. I didn't comment on the font opinions. We found a rhythm that was easy without being close, comfortable without meaning anything. The particular domestic peace of two people who have decided not to require too much of each other. I told myself that was exactly what I wanted. I was a decent liar for about 6 weeks. The company Christmas party was her first event as a client at an agency she just started working with. She'd mentioned it 3 times in the week before, not the party itself, but the logistics of the party, the time, the location. The fact that the dress code was cocktail and that she wasn't sure her black dress still fit properly since the last time she'd worn it. I heard this without offering an opinion because I had the good sense to understand that was not what was being asked of me. The night arrived. She'd been in her room getting ready for 40 minutes. I was on the sofa with a manuscript I wasn't reading, which was my usual activity on evenings I was pretending not to notice something. Then, I heard the particular silence that follows a series of small, increasingly frustrated sounds from the other side of a wall. The kind of silence that means a person has stopped trying. Her door opened. She was already in the dress, black, short-sleeved, The kind of thing that required no introduction. But the zip at the back was halfway up, and her hands were at her sides, and she was looking at the middle distance with an expression I hadn't seen on her before. Not distress. Something past distress. Something that had settled. "I can't get the zip," she said. "Turn around," I said, and set the manuscript down. She turned. I stood up. I crossed the room and found the zip where it had stuck, caught on a thread at the seam just below the shoulder blade, the kind of thing that required patience and a specific angle. I worked it carefully. She was very still under my hands. "Almost," I said. "It's fine," she said quietly. "It's a sign anyway." "Sign of what?" She was quiet for a moment. "Then, that's why no one wants me." I went still. She said it the way she'd said everything that evening. Practical, matter of fact. Like it was an explanation for the zip, and also for something much larger than the zip, and she had stopped expecting either of them to be different. I said, "I do. I have, as previously mentioned, poor instincts after 11 p.m. It was 7:45. I have no excuse." She turned around slowly. The zip was still halfway. I hadn't finished. She turned anyway, and she looked at me, and I looked back at her, and neither of us said anything for long enough that it became its own kind of statement. "Daniel," she said. "Yeah," I said. She stopped. "I know what it is," I said. She looked at me for another moment. Her expression was doing something I had not seen before. Not the wariness, not the careful politeness, not the considered distance. Something underneath those. Something that had been there the whole time and was now apparently just above the surface. She turned back around. "Quietly, finish the zip," she said. I did. Carefully, it slid the rest of the way without any trouble. She went to her party. I went back to the manuscript I wasn't reading. I sat with what I'd said, the way you sit with something you didn't plan to say and then find, when you search yourself, that you meant completely. She came home at 11. I was still on the sofa. The manuscript was closed. I had made no pretense of the reading by that point. She set her bag on the kitchen counter and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Good party." "Good," I said. She poured herself a glass of water, stood at the counter. I watched her, the way I'd gotten in the habit of watching her without calling it that, the way you track something that has quietly become important. "You didn't have to say that," she said, finally. "I know. It's a strange thing to say. I know that too." She was quiet, turned the glass in her hands. She had a habit of doing this, turning objects, small rotations, when she was working something out. I had noticed it by week 3 and said nothing about it for weeks after that. "Was it true?" she said. I looked at her from the sofa. "Yes," I said. She nodded once, the way she nodded when she received information she needed time to process. Not dismissing it. Filing it. She took her water to her room and closed the door, and I sat in the quiet apartment and understood that something had shifted in a direction I couldn't reverse, and found, somewhat to my surprise, that I didn't want to. The next 3 weeks were an education in what it looks like when two people who live together decide, without discussing it, to be slightly more careful with each other. She started leaving the kitchen before I finished my coffee. I started taking longer to respond to things she said, because I was noticing more about how she said them. We were both pretending very hard to be normal, which is the least normal behavior available to two adults who have said something true and then agreed not to look directly at it. The second thing happened on a Sunday evening. She was at the kitchen table with her laptop and her jar of pens, working on something she'd been muttering about for days. I was making dinner, actual dinner, not cereal, and I set a plate next to her without asking, because she'd been there for 3 hours and I'd noticed she hadn't eaten. She looked at the plate, then at me. "You don't have to feed me," she said. "I made too much," I said, which was true. I had also made it specifically. She picked up a pen, set it down, picked up her fork. "Daniel," she said. "Nadia," I said. She ate the food. She didn't say thank you, which is how I knew it meant something, because she always said thank you for ordinary things, and this wasn't ordinary, and she knew I knew it wasn't ordinary, and the thank you would have made it smaller than it was. The third thing happened 2 weeks after that. She had an early client call, and she was running late, and she came into the kitchen already dressed, already moving, and I handed her the travel mug before she reached the coffee maker. She stopped, looked at the mug. It had her preferred amount of milk in it, a specific ratio she'd never told me, but that I had observed over 9 weeks of shared mornings. She took the mug. She looked at me for a moment. "You know how I take my coffee," she said. "You take it the same way every day," I said. "You noticed." "Hard not to," I said. She held my gaze for 1 second longer than felt entirely safe. Then she went to her call. I stood in the kitchen for a while after she left, holding my own coffee and understanding that we had been building towards something neither of us had yet named, and that the naming was coming, whether I was ready or not. The fourth thing was smaller. She had a project due on a Friday, and she'd been working on it for 6 days in a way that had slowly taken over the apartment. Reference images pinned to the corkboard she'd moved from her room to the kitchen wall, printouts spread across the table, 3 cups of cold tea she'd forgotten at various stages. On the Thursday night, she sent it. I heard her say "done" to herself through the wall. 5 minutes later she came out and sat on the sofa with the posture of someone who had just put down something very heavy. I was at my desk. I turned my chair. "Good?" I asked. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me in a week." We sat like that for a while, her on the sofa, me in the chair. The apartment quiet in the particular way it gets late on a weeknight, when the city outside has settled into itself. At some point she pulled her knees up and rested her chin on them and looked at the corkboard, still full of her reference images, and she said, "I like it in here." "The living room?" I said. "The apartment," she said. "I like living here." She said it simply, like it was a fact she'd verified and was now reporting. She wasn't looking at me. But the sentence was pointed somewhere, and I knew exactly where it was pointed, and I sat with it for a moment before I said, "I like you living here." She turned and looked at me then. Briefly, the corner of her mouth did something small and real. Then she said good night and went to bed, and I sat in the chair for 20 minutes after that, understanding that we had arrived somewhere. That we were standing at the edge of something that was no longer avoidable. That the only question remaining was which one of us would say the next true thing. It was a Saturday in January when it actually happened. She'd been quiet all day, not the easy quiet of concentration, but the other kind. The kind she got when something was sitting with her that she hadn't found the right place for yet. I recognized it, because I had spent 9 weeks learning the difference. I was at the counter. She was at the table. At some point in the late afternoon, she closed her laptop and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Something resolved, something that had made a decision. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "Yes," I said. She turned the pen in her hands twice, set it down. "I have been telling myself," she said carefully, "that you were just being kind. When you said that, and I have been telling myself that for 7 weeks, and I've run out of ways to make that version convincing." I set my coffee down. "Nadia," I said. "Because the coffee," she said. "And the food." And the way you don't comment on the pens, but I've noticed you've learned which ones are which. And you said, she stopped, looked at her hands. You said it like you meant it. I did mean it, I said. I know, she said. Quiet. That's the part I can't make smaller. I crossed the kitchen. She looked up at me when I reached the table, and I reached out and covered her hand with mine, and she turned her palm up the way people do when they have decided to stop bracing. I've wanted to tell you something for about 6 weeks, I said. I didn't because I thought you needed the room to settle in, to feel safe here. And I didn't want to be the thing that made this apartment complicated for you. She was very still. So I kept making coffee, I said, and food, and learning the pens. She laughed, quick and surprised and real, the kind that arrived before she could manage it into something smaller. Her eyes went bright. She didn't try to hide it. That is a deeply strange way to tell someone, she said. I didn't know how to say it plainly, I said. And then the zip happened. She laughed again, and then she went quiet, and she looked at our hands on the table. I changed my phone lock screen, she said, the week after. I didn't know why, I just did. And then I looked at it and I thought, I know exactly why. She reached into her pocket and showed me. A photo, the kitchen window, the jar of pens, morning light. Something ordinary that she'd kept. I felt something move in my chest. Not dramatically, just into place. You should probably tell me what the lock screen means, I said. I think you know what it means, she said. I'd like to hear it, I said. She looked at me. She had the expression of someone who has made a decision and is now standing on the other side of it, slightly amazed at what the view is like from here. It means, she said, that I don't think you were just being kind. I leaned down and pressed my forehead gently to hers. She exhaled, slow, like she'd been holding it for longer than one afternoon. Her hand turned and held mine properly. From the other room, her laptop made the sound of an email arriving. She groaned softly. I laughed. She didn't move for a moment, and then she did, and the moment came back to something that felt like us, which was the best thing about it. That it felt like us, already, like it had always been headed here. 4 months later, when her friend Maya asked how we'd ended up together, Nadia said it started with a broken zip. Maya asked for more information. Nadia told her the story and Maya said, "He said he did? On the first night?" And Nadia said, 7 weeks in, actually, and Maya said that was worse, because it meant he'd been thinking it for 7 weeks, and Nadia said yes, and she had been too, and that was essentially the whole story. The dress is still in her wardrobe. She wore it again in March. The zip worked perfectly, she showed me before she left, running it up and back down once with a pointed look that I chose to find entirely endearing. I told her the dress was fine, the zip was fine, everything was fine. She told me to stop being smug. I told her I was being sincere. She said those weren't mutually exclusive with her, and she was right, which she usually is. And I usually say so early because it saves time, and because the way she looks when I admit it has never once stopped being worth it. She moved the jar of pens to the kitchen windowsill in February. I didn't comment. She didn't explain. The spice rack is still arranged the way she prefers it. I have learned to leave it alone. Nothing about what we are was a surprise, once I let myself look directly at it. It had been there from the first Sunday she appeared in the kitchen having solved something, from the bookshelf she'd thought worth rescuing, from the way she turned objects in her hands when she was working out what she actually thought. It had been building in every small thing I'd noticed, without naming. I just needed to say one true sentence. She did the rest.